Carl Jung explained. 13 clues. The soul knows when it has found true love. There's a secret that the modern world doesn't want you to know, a truth so profound that it threatens the very foundation of how we think about love, relationships, and human connection. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychologist who dared to map the deepest territories of the human psyche, discovered something that would make most relationship experts uncomfortable. He found that what we call love is usually nothing more than an elaborate psychological illusion. The meeting of two personalities, Jung wrote, is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But here's what he didn't tell the general public, what he reserved for his most advanced students in private writings. Most people never actually meet another personality at all. They fall in love with projections, with carefully constructed masks, with the shadows of their own unlived lives, reflected back at them through another person's eyes. You've been living in a world where 90% of relationships fail, not because people are incompatible, but because they never truly see each other. They love ghosts, phantoms, psychological mirages that evaporate the moment real intimacy threatens to break through. And the most heartbreaking part? They have no idea this is happening. But there's another way, a forbidden psychology that reveals how the soul, yes, the soul, has its own ancient intelligence. It knows things the mind cannot grasp. It recognizes connections that logic cannot explain. And when it encounters its true counterpart, it sends 13 specific signals, 13 unmistakable clues that you've moved beyond the realm of projection and entered the sacred territory of genuine recognition. Tonight, I'm going to share with you these 13 clues, not the romantic platitudes you've heard 1,000 times, but the deep psychological signatures that Jung discovered in his decades of working with couples, analyzing dreams, and mapping the unconscious mind. These are the signs that distinguish soul-level connection from the epidemic of unconscious relationships that surrounds us. But I must warn you, once you understand these principles, you'll never be able to look at love the same way again. You'll see through the illusions that most people mistake for romance. You'll recognize the psychological projections that masquerade as attraction. And you'll understand why so many relationships that feel meant to be in the beginning end in confusion and pain. Jung himself said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." What if I told you that this principle holds the key to understanding not just what triggers us, but what truly attracts us? What if the people we're drawn to, the ones we think we love, are actually mirrors reflecting back the parts of ourselves we've lost, disowned, or never learned to express? This is the journey we're about to take together, from the surface level of conscious attraction down into the mysterious depths where the soul recognizes its own reflection in another. From the persona, the mask we wear for the world, down to the authentic self that seeks its complement in genuine intimacy. You are about to discover why most people live their entire lives without ever experiencing true soul recognition, why they settle for persona-to-persona connections that feel safe but ultimately empty. And most importantly, you're going to learn how to recognize when the universe has arranged for your soul to meet its match. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone and felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity? Not the superficial recognition of shared interests or similar backgrounds, but something deeper. Something that whispered, "I know you," even though you'd never met before. Something that felt both completely comfortable and mysteriously unsettling at the same time. If so, comment below and let me know. Because that feeling, that recognition that transcends logic, might have been your first clue that you'd encountered something far rarer than you realized. Your soul recognizing its counterpart, across the crowded landscape of unconscious relating. The ancient Greeks had 4 different words for love: eros, philia, storge, and agape. But Jung discovered a 5th kind of love, one that encompasses all the others, while transcending them entirely. He called it the love of individuation, the love that emerges when 2 people who have done the work of becoming conscious encounter each other in the fullness of their authentic being. This is not the love of projection, where we fall for our own unlived potential reflected in another. This is not the love of the persona, where we're attracted to someone's carefully crafted image. This is not even the love of the shadow, where we're drawn to someone who expresses what we've repressed. This is the love of recognition, soul recognizing soul, across the vast darkness of an unconscious world. And it changes everything. Let me tell you about David and Sarah. They met at a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning in downtown Seattle. David was reading Jung's Modern Man in Search of a Soul when Sarah approached him, captivated by his intellectual depth and sophisticated taste in psychology. She was dressed impeccably, her makeup perfect, her laugh melodic and well-timed. He was charming, articulate, discussing complex psychological concepts with the kind of confident ease that suggested both intelligence and emotional availability. They fell in love instantly, or so they thought. What they actually fell in love with were each other's personas, those carefully constructed social masks that Jung identified as one of the primary barriers to authentic human connection. David was attracted to Sarah's poised, cultured femininity, her apparent emotional stability, her ability to engage with his interests while maintaining an air of mystery. Sarah was drawn to David's intellectual confidence, his seeming emotional depth, his status as someone who read psychology and spoke eloquently about the human condition. 6 months later, their relationship was crumbling. David discovered that Sarah's perfect composure was actually a rigid defense against a deep well of anxiety and insecurity. Her sophisticated engagement with his interests was more performance than genuine curiosity. Her mysterious air was actually emotional unavailability disguised as depth. Sarah, meanwhile, found that David's intellectual confidence masked a profound fear of genuine intimacy. His psychological sophistication was more academic than lived experience. His articulate discussions of emotions were actually a way of avoiding feeling them. They had fallen in love with illusions, with personas, with masks that each had spent years perfecting to hide their true selves from the world. This is the first great trap that prevents us from recognizing genuine soul connection. Jung wrote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. It's the role we play, the image we project, the version of ourselves we think will be most acceptable to others. And it's so convincing that we often forget it's not who we really are. The persona serves a crucial function in social life. It allows us to navigate professional relationships, casual interactions, and the complex demands of living in society. But when we bring our personas into intimate relationships, something catastrophic happens. We fall in love with performances rather than people. We become addicted to being seen in a certain way, rather than being known for who we truly are. Think about your own dating persona for a moment. What version of yourself do you present? When you're trying to attract someone, are you funnier than you really are? More confident? More interested in certain activities? More emotionally stable? More adventurous or more grounded than your authentic self? Most people have spent so much time perfecting their dating persona that they've lost touch with the person beneath the mask. They've become so identified with the image they project that they genuinely believe it is who they are. This creates what Jung called persona inflation, the dangerous illusion that we are the roles we play rather than the complex, contradictory, beautifully human beings we actually are. But here's where it gets truly tragic. When we operate from our persona, we can only attract other personas. We create relationships based on mutual performance rather than mutual recognition. Two actors on a stage, each playing a role designed to please the other, neither knowing who they're actually in relationship with. The persona honeymoon period can be intoxicating. Everything seems perfect. You've found someone who appreciates your carefully crafted image, who responds positively to your performance, who seems to complement the version of yourself you've decided is most lovable. You feel seen, valued, desired, but only for your mask, never for your authentic self. Then reality begins to seep in. The persona is exhausting to maintain. It requires constant vigilance, constant performance, constant energy. Eventually, cracks begin to appear. You have a bad day, and your usual charm feels forced. You're tired and can't maintain your usual level of emotional availability. You get triggered and react in a way that doesn't fit your carefully constructed image. This is when most persona-based relationships begin to unravel. The person you've been dating looks at you with confusion, disappointment, sometimes even betrayal. This isn't the person I fell in love with, they think, and they're right. The person they fell in love with was a performance, a mask, a beautiful, seductive, ultimately hollow construction that was never meant to be sustained indefinitely. Jung observed that the persona is a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. The key word here is conceal. The persona doesn't just present a certain image, it actively hides who we really are. But what are we hiding? What lies beneath the mask that we're so afraid to reveal? This is where Jung's psychology becomes truly profound. Beneath the persona lies what he called the personal unconscious, all the parts of ourselves we've learned to suppress, repress, or deny, our fears, our insecurities, our unacceptable desires, our painful memories, our unlived potential. All the aspects of our personality that don't fit the image we want to project get pushed down into the darkness beneath the mask. In persona-based relationships, these hidden aspects don't disappear. They become the source of constant tension, misunderstanding, and eventually the dissolution of the connection. Because you can't truly love someone you don't truly know, and you can't truly know someone who's hiding behind a mask, even if they've been wearing it for so long that they've forgotten it's not their real face. Now, let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. What aspects of yourself do you hide when you're in a romantic relationship? What parts of your personality do you think are unacceptable, unlovable, or too messy to reveal? What do you fear would happen if your partner saw you without your mask on? Take a moment to really consider this, because until you can answer these questions honestly, you'll continue to attract persona-level connections rather than soul-level recognition. The tragedy of persona-based love is that it's not actually love at all. It's admiration for a performance. It's attraction to an image. It's the ego's desire to be seen in a certain way, reflected back through another person's approval of our carefully constructed self-presentation. But the soul, the deeper, truer self that exists beneath all the masks and performances, remains unseen, unknown, and ultimately unloved. It stands in the shadows of the relationship, watching the personas dance their elaborate courtship ritual, knowing that none of this has anything to do with genuine intimacy or authentic connection. This is why so many relationships that begin with intense attraction and apparent compatibility eventually feel hollow, unfulfilling, or simply boring. The personas can only interact in so many ways. They have limited repertoires, predictable responses, acceptable ranges of expression. Eventually, you've seen all of each other's performances. You know all the lines, all the gestures, all the carefully crafted responses to various situations. And then what? Do you continue the performance indefinitely? Do you resign yourself to a relationship with a beautiful stranger who happens to play a role you find attractive? Or do you have the courage to drop the mask and risk being seen for who you really are? This is the first great choice point in any relationship that has the potential to become something more than a mutual admiration society for well-constructed personas. Someone has to be willing to let the mask slip. Someone has to risk revealing the person beneath the performance. And here's what Jung discovered. When one person in a relationship begins to drop their persona, it creates a crisis. The other person either feels invited to do the same, or they feel threatened and try to pressure their partner back into the familiar mask. This is the moment of truth. This is where you discover whether you're in a relationship with someone who wants to know you or someone who only wants to admire your performance. True soul recognition, the kind of love we're exploring in this journey together, can only begin when the personas start to fall away, when two people become willing to risk being seen, known, and potentially rejected for who they actually are beneath all the careful constructions of social acceptability. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he might have added that the courage of a lifetime is to let someone else see who you truly are, all of it, the light and the darkness, the strength and the vulnerability, the beauty and the broken places that make you irreducibly, authentically human. If you're still with me, if something in this exploration is resonating with the deeper parts of your psyche, then you're ready to go even deeper. Because beneath the persona lies another layer of unconscious material that shapes our romantic attractions in ways that most people never recognize or understand. Let me introduce you to the shadow and show you how this hidden aspect of your personality might be the secret puppet master behind every relationship you've ever been in. Michael had a pattern. Every woman he fell madly in love with was what he called free-spirited. They were artists, dancers, musicians, wanderers. They lived spontaneously, followed their impulses, created beauty from chaos. They embodied everything that felt alive and authentic and real. He was magnetically drawn to their wildness, their unpredictability, their refusal to live by society's rules. And every relationship followed the same arc: intense attraction, passionate romance, a period of feeling more alive than ever before, followed by mounting frustration, increasing conflict, and an inevitable ending that left both people confused and hurt. She was too chaotic, he would tell himself after each breakup. Too unreliable, too unpredictable. I need someone more stable, more grounded, more responsible. But within months, he would find himself attracted to another free spirit, another wild soul who seemed to embody everything his carefully structured life was missing. The pattern repeated itself so many times that his friends began to joke about his type. But Michael couldn't see the deeper psychological mechanism that was driving his attractions. He had no idea that he wasn't falling in love with these women at all. He was falling in love with his own disowned spontaneity projected onto their personalities. This is shadow projection, and it might be the most powerful unconscious force shaping your romantic life. Jung discovered that every personality contains not just the aspects we identify with and express openly, but also their opposites, the qualities, impulses, and potentials we've learned to suppress, deny, or hide from ourselves. This disowned material doesn't disappear. It lives in what he called the shadow, the personal unconscious repository of everything we've decided is unacceptable about ourselves. Michael had grown up in a family that valued control, responsibility, and careful planning above all else. Spontaneity was dangerous, creativity was impractical, following impulses led to chaos and disappointment. So he learned to suppress these aspects of himself to become the responsible, reliable, predictable son his family needed him to be. But the spontaneous, creative, impulsive parts of his personality didn't die. They went underground, into the shadow, where they continued to live and breathe and yearn for expression. And because he couldn't consciously integrate these qualities into his own identity, he projected them onto others, specifically onto the women he fell in love with. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. But most people spend their entire lives running from their darkness, trying to maintain the illusion that they are only their conscious, socially acceptable selves. And this creates a psychological vacuum that gets filled through projection and attraction. Here's how shadow projection works in romantic relationships. We unconsciously seek partners who embody the qualities we've disowned in ourselves. If you've suppressed your anger, you'll be drawn to passionate, fiery people. If you've denied your vulnerability, you'll be attracted to sensitive, emotional types. If you've disowned your wildness, you'll fall for free spirits and rebels. This creates what feels like intense chemistry, but it's actually psychological compensation. You feel more whole around this person because they're expressing the parts of yourself you've lost touch with. You feel alive in their presence because they're living the unlived portions of your own personality. You feel like they complete you because, in a very real psychological sense, they do. They carry the missing pieces of your own psyche. The early stages of shadow projection feel magical. You found someone who embodies everything you admire but don't possess. They seem to have access to qualities that feel foreign but deeply appealing. They inspire you, challenge you, make you feel like you're in contact with aspects of life you'd forgotten existed. But shadow projection is inherently unstable, because these qualities don't actually belong to the other person. They belong to you. You're not loving them. You're loving your own unlived potential reflected in their personality. And this creates several inevitable problems. First, you're not seeing them clearly. You're seeing them through the lens of your projection. You're attributing to them qualities they may not actually possess, or possessing only partially. You're falling in love with your fantasy of who they are rather than who they actually are. Second, you're putting enormous pressure on them to carry qualities that are actually yours to develop. Michael expected his free-spirited partners to provide all the spontaneity and creativity in the relationship. He wanted them to be wild so he could feel alive by association, but he never took responsibility for developing these qualities in himself. Third, you're creating an imbalanced dynamic where you idealize them for having what you lack while unconsciously resenting them for not being more like you. Michael was attracted to his partner's spontaneity, but he also criticized them for being irresponsible. He wanted their creativity, but he judged them for being impractical. He needed their aliveness, but he resented their unpredictability. And finally, shadow projection prevents genuine intimacy because you're not in relationship with a real person. You're in relationship with your own unlived life. You can't truly know someone you're projecting onto, and you can't truly love someone you're using as a repository for your disowned aspects. This is why shadow-based relationships follow such predictable patterns. The honeymoon period feels intoxicating because you're in contact with lost parts of yourself. But as the relationship deepens, the projection begins to break down. You start to see your partner more clearly as a real person rather than a symbol. And this is when the problems begin. The qualities you were initially attracted to start to irritate you. The spontaneity becomes chaos. The sensitivity becomes neediness. The passion becomes drama. You begin to criticize your partner for the very qualities that attracted you, because now you're seeing them without the filter of projection. Meanwhile, your partner feels increasingly misunderstood. They sense that you were never really in love with them, but with some idealized version of them that they can't possibly maintain. They feel pressure to embody qualities that may not even be natural to them. They feel like they're failing you by being human rather than the projection you fell in love with. Jung observed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This is never more true than in romantic relationships. The things that trigger you most intensely in your partner are usually shadows of your own disowned material. The qualities you criticize most harshly are often the ones you've suppressed in yourself. But here's where the real work begins. Instead of blaming your partner for possessing the qualities that both attract and irritate you, you can use their presence as a mirror to understand what you've disowned in yourself. Instead of expecting them to carry your unlived potential, you can reclaim those qualities and begin to integrate them into your own personality. This is what Jung called shadow work, and it's essential for moving beyond projection-based attraction toward genuine soul recognition. Because until you own your shadow, until you reclaim the parts of yourself you've disowned, you'll continue to seek them in others. You'll continue to fall in love with projections rather than people. Let me give you a practical exercise. Think about the person you've been most intensely attracted to in your life. What qualities did they possess that you found irresistible? Write them down. Now ask yourself, which of these qualities have you suppressed or denied in yourself? Which of them represent aspects of your personality that you've learned are unacceptable, dangerous, or inappropriate? This isn't comfortable work. It requires admitting that the very qualities you've spent years suppressing might actually be essential parts of who you are. It means questioning the family, cultural, and social conditioning that taught you certain aspects of yourself were unacceptable. It means risking the disapproval of people who prefer you to remain predictable and controllable. But it's also liberating work, because as you reclaim your shadow, as you integrate the disowned parts of your personality, you become more whole. You become less dependent on others to carry your unlived potential. You become capable of loving people for who they are rather than for what they represent. And this is when something remarkable happens. When you stop projecting your shadow onto others, you start attracting different kinds of people. Instead of being drawn to others who carry your disowned material, you begin to attract people who complement your wholeness rather than compensate for your incompleteness. Michael's story had a different ending when he finally understood the shadow dynamics driving his attractions. Instead of seeking another free spirit to carry his suppressed spontaneity, he began doing the work of reclaiming these qualities in himself. He took art classes, learned to dance, practiced following impulses and making spontaneous choices. He discovered that he wasn't actually attracted to chaos. He was attracted to aliveness, creativity, and authentic self-expression. When he met Jennifer, she wasn't a wild, unpredictable artist. She was a woman who had also done her shadow work, who had integrated both her spontaneous and her responsible aspects. She could be spontaneous without being chaotic, creative without being impractical, alive without being unstable, and because Michael had reclaimed his own spontaneity, he could appreciate her qualities without needing her to carry them for him. Their relationship was built on recognition rather than projection. They saw each other clearly because they had learned to see themselves clearly. They loved each other's wholeness rather than each other's representations of their unlived lives. But shadow work is just the beginning, because beneath the shadow lies an even deeper layer of unconscious material that shapes our romantic attractions in ways that most people never recognize. Jung called these the anima and animus, the internal masculine and feminine principles that live within every psyche. Are you ready to meet the inner beloved that you've been unconsciously seeking in every relationship you've ever had? Jennifer thought she knew what she wanted in a man. He would be strong, decisive, intellectually powerful, emotionally stable, and completely reliable. He would take charge of situations, make difficult decisions without wavering, protect her from the chaos of an uncertain world. He would be her rock, her anchor, her masculine complement to her feminine essence. This fantasy drove her through relationship after relationship with men who seemed to embody these qualities. CEOs, military officers, entrepreneurs, doctors, successful, powerful men who projected strength and authority. She was magnetically drawn to their confidence, their ability to navigate challenges, their apparent emotional invulnerability. But every relationship followed the same pattern. Initial attraction to their strength became resentment of their emotional unavailability. Admiration for their decisiveness turned into frustration with their inability to consider her perspective. Appreciation for their stability transformed into boredom with their predictability. She would find herself longing for sensitivity, vulnerability, emotional depth, all the qualities her strong men seemed to lack. What Jennifer didn't understand was that she wasn't looking for a man at all. She was looking for her own, undeveloped, masculine qualities projected onto someone else's personality. She was seeking her animus, Jung's term for the unconscious masculine principle that lives within every woman's psyche. This might be the most revolutionary insight in all of Jungian psychology. We don't fall in love with other people. We fall in love with our own unlived psychological potential carried by someone else. And until we learn to develop a conscious relationship with these internal figures, we're doomed to project them onto external partners who can never fulfill the impossible task of being our missing psychological pieces. Jung discovered that every human psyche contains both masculine and feminine principles regardless of biological sex. In women, he called the unconscious masculine the animus. In men, he called the unconscious feminine the anima. These aren't gender roles or social constructs. They're fundamental psychological patterns that shape our perception, thinking, feeling, and relating. The animus represents the woman's capacity for focused thinking, assertive action, spiritual seeking, and penetrating insight. It's her inner masculine that can take a stand, make decisions, pursue goals, and engage with the world of ideas and abstract principles. When the animus is unconscious, a woman projects these qualities onto men, seeking in external relationships what she needs to develop within herself. The anima represents the man's capacity for receptive feeling, emotional depth, intuitive knowing, and soulful connection. It's his inner feminine that can feel deeply, create beauty, nurture growth, and engage with the world of emotions and relational nuance. When the anima is unconscious, a man projects these qualities onto women, seeking in external relationships what he needs to develop within himself. But here's where it gets complex. These internal figures aren't just passive psychological principles, they're dynamic, autonomous complexes with their own personalities, preferences, and agendas. Jung discovered that they could take possession of a person's conscious mind, creating moods, opinions, and behaviors that seem to come from nowhere. When a woman is possessed by her animus, she might become argumentative, opinionated, and rigidly intellectual. She loses touch with her feeling function and becomes identified with masculine thinking patterns that aren't integrated with her overall personality. When a man is possessed by his anima, he might become moody, oversensitive, and emotionally reactive. He loses touch with his thinking function and becomes identified with feminine feeling patterns that overwhelm his conscious perspective. These possessions are often triggered by romantic relationships. When Jennifer met one of her strong, decisive men, her animus would become activated. But because she had no conscious relationship with this internal masculine, it would either remain projected onto her partner or take possession of her personality in unhealthy ways. In the projection phase, She would expect her partner to carry all the decisiveness, strength, and intellectual power in the relationship. She would become dependent on him for these qualities, unable to access them in herself. This created enormous pressure on the relationship and prevented her from developing her own psychological wholeness. In the possession phase, her animus would take over her personality in crude, undeveloped ways. She would become argumentative, demanding, and controlling, trying to access masculine qualities through force rather than integration. This would confuse and alienate her partners, who had been attracted to her feminine presence, but now encountered harsh, critical, demanding energy that felt foreign to both of them. The same patterns play out for men with their anima. David, whom we met in the persona chapter, was unconsciously seeking his anima in every woman he dated. He was drawn to feminine qualities of emotional depth, intuitive wisdom, aesthetic sensitivity, and relational connection. But because he had no conscious relationship with his own inner feminine, he either projected these qualities onto his partners or became possessed by crude, undeveloped anima moods. In projection, he expected his partners to provide all the emotional intelligence, aesthetic beauty, and relational wisdom in the relationship. He would become dependent on them for access to feeling, beauty, and soulful connection. When they failed to carry these projections perfectly, he would feel disappointed and resentful. In possession, his anima would overwhelm his conscious personality with moods, emotional reactivity, and hypersensitivity that he couldn't understand or control. He would become sulky, demanding, and emotionally manipulative, trying to access feminine qualities through unconscious identification rather than conscious integration. Jung wrote, "The anima is the archetype of life itself." But he could have said the same about the animus. These internal figures represent our connection to the fundamental life forces that we need for psychological wholeness. When they remain unconscious, they distort our relationships and prevent us from becoming fully individuated human beings. The path to conscious relationship with the anima and animus is what Jung called the inner marriage, the integration of masculine and feminine principles within the individual psyche. This doesn't mean becoming androgynous or losing touch with your primary gender identification. It means developing a conscious, respectful relationship with the contrasexual elements of your own personality. For Jennifer, this meant learning to access her animus consciously, rather than projecting it onto men or being possessed by it unconsciously. She began to notice when she was looking to external partners for strength, decisiveness, or intellectual authority that she could develop in herself. She started making her own decisions, taking positions on important issues, pursuing intellectual interests that challenged her thinking. She also learned to recognize animus possession, those times when she became argumentative, opinionated, or rigidly intellectual in ways that disconnected her from her feeling function. Instead of being taken over by these energies, she developed the capacity to step back, recognize what was happening, and find more integrated ways to express her masculine side. Most importantly, she began to understand that her animus had its own personality, preferences, and wisdom. Through active imagination, Jung's technique of conscious dialogue with unconscious figures, she developed a relationship with this internal masculine that was collaborative rather than projective or possessive. The animus told her things she needed to know about her own strength, her capacity for independent thinking, her ability to stand up for herself in challenging situations. It guided her toward activities, interests, and expressions that helped her become more whole. And as she developed this internal relationship, her external relationships began to change dramatically. Instead of being attracted to men who carried her projected animus, she began to be attracted to men who had done their own inner work, men who had developed conscious relationships with their own anima, who could access both strength and sensitivity thinking and feeling, assertion and receptivity. Men who were looking for a partner rather than a missing psychological piece. David's journey followed a similar pattern. As he developed a conscious relationship with his anima, he stopped expecting women to provide all the emotional depth, aesthetic beauty, and relational wisdom in his life. He began to access his own capacity for feeling deeply, creating beauty, and connecting soulfully with life. He learned to recognize anima possession and find more integrated ways to express his feminine side. His anima became his inner guide to the world of emotions, relationships, and aesthetic experience. She helped him understand the subtleties of feeling, the importance of beauty, the value of receptivity and intuitive knowing. And as he developed this internal relationship, he became capable of appreciating these qualities in women without needing them to carry his projections. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the inner marriage. Not the external marriage between two people, but the internal marriage between masculine and feminine principles within the individual psyche. This inner marriage is the foundation for all genuine external relationships because it frees us from the unconscious need to find our missing pieces in other people. When a woman has developed a conscious relationship with her animus, she can appreciate masculine qualities in men without needing them to be her strength, her decisiveness, her intellectual authority. When a man has developed a conscious relationship with his anima, he can appreciate feminine qualities in women without needing them to be his emotional depth, his aesthetic sense, his relational wisdom. This creates the possibility for what Jung called conjunctio, the sacred marriage between two whole individuals rather than the neurotic bonding between two half-people seeking completion in each other. But developing conscious relationships with the anima and animus is challenging work. These figures can be elusive, contradictory, and sometimes hostile to conscious integration. They often prefer to remain in the unconscious, influencing our attractions and relationships from the shadows rather than submitting to the discipline of conscious development. The animus can be particularly difficult for women to integrate because many cultural messages tell women that masculine qualities like assertiveness, intellectual authority, and independent decision-making are unfeminine or threatening. Women may fear that developing their animus will make them less attractive to men or less acceptable in social situations. The anima can be challenging for men to integrate because cultural conditioning often teaches men that feminine qualities like emotional sensitivity, aesthetic appreciation, and relational attunement are signs of weakness or inadequacy. Men may fear that accessing their anima will compromise their masculine identity or make them less effective in competitive situations. But Jung discovered that psychological wholeness requires the integration of these contrasexual elements. A woman who cannot access her animus remains dependent on external sources of strength and authority. A man who cannot access his anima remains disconnected from the emotional and aesthetic dimensions of life. More importantly, for our exploration of soul recognition, people who have not developed conscious relationships with their anima or animus will continue to project these figures onto potential partners. They will be attracted to people who carry their missing psychological pieces rather than people who complement their wholeness. True soul recognition, the kind of love that transforms both people without requiring either to complete the other, can only occur between individuals who have done the work of inner marriage. Because only then can you see another person clearly, love them for who they are rather than what they represent, and offer yourself as a whole being rather than a half-person seeking completion. So let me ask you, what masculine or feminine qualities do you consistently seek in romantic partners? What aspects of the opposite gender do you find most attractive or compelling? These attractions may be pointing you toward your own anima or animus, the internal beloved you need to marry before you can truly recognize your external soulmate. And with that recognition, we arrive at the first of our 13 clues, the first sign that you've moved beyond projection, persona, and animus confusion into the territory of genuine soul recognition. Are you ready to discover what happens when the soul recognizes its true counterpart? It was 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon when Marcus first saw Elena across the crowded bookstore. She was standing in the philosophy section, holding a worn copy of The Red Book, Jung's personal journal of his confrontation with the unconscious. But it wasn't the book that stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't her appearance, though she was beautiful. It wasn't even the obvious synchronicity of finding someone reading Jung in a random bookstore. It was something else, something that bypassed his rational mind entirely and spoke directly to the deepest layers of his psyche, a recognition that felt both ancient and immediate, a sense that he had been looking for this person his entire life without knowing what he was looking for, a feeling that whispered with absolute certainty, "I know you." He had never seen her before. They had no mutual friends, no shared history, no logical reason for this overwhelming sense of familiarity. Yet something in his soul was saying, "Finally, there you are." This is the first clue of genuine soul recognition, a knowing that transcends logic, explanation, or rational understanding. It's not the superficial love at first sight that's actually persona attraction or shadow projection. It's not the rush of chemistry that comes from recognizing your unlived potential in someone else. It's something deeper, older, more mysterious, the soul recognizing its counterpart across the vast landscape of human consciousness. Jung wrote about this phenomenon in his analysis of what he called fateful encounters. He observed that certain meetings between people carried a numinous quality, a sense of significance that went beyond ordinary social interaction. These encounters felt charged with meaning, as if they were orchestrated by forces beyond individual will or conscious intention. But Jung also warned about the dangers of romanticizing this experience. Not every strong attraction, every sense of familiarity, every feeling of meant to be is actually soul recognition. Most of what people interpret as destined connection is actually psychological projection dressed up in spiritual language. So how do you distinguish between genuine soul recognition and the countless psychological illusions that masquerade as spiritual connection? The first distinction is the quality of the knowing itself. Projection-based attraction feels needy, hungry, desperately seeking something from the other person. Shadow attraction feels compulsive, driven by an unconscious urgency to possess or be possessed by qualities you've disowned. Animus projection feels like finding your missing half, your completion, your salvation in human form. But genuine soul recognition feels different. It feels like remembering rather than discovering. It feels peaceful rather than desperate. It feels like coming home rather than finding something you've been desperately seeking. There's a quality of inevitability about it, but not the inevitability of compulsion, the inevitability of recognition. Marcus described it later as the difference between hunger and satisfaction. "I wasn't looking at Elena thinking, 'I need this person to complete me,'" he said. "I was looking at her thinking, of course it's you." Elena felt it too. Later, she would describe the moment as recognition without memory. She felt like she knew Marcus intimately, could predict his gestures, understand his thoughts, anticipate his responses. Yet she had no conscious memory of ever meeting him before. It was as if some deeper layer of her psyche was saying, "This person is familiar to my soul, even though they're new to my mind." This points to one of Jung's most radical ideas, that individual consciousness is connected to something larger, deeper, more comprehensive than personal experience. He called it the collective unconscious, the shared psychological substrate that connects all human beings across time, culture, and individual difference. In the collective unconscious, Jung theorized, exist what he called archetypes, universal patterns of psychological experience that shape human consciousness in predictable ways. These archetypes include figures like the great mother, the wise old man, the hero, the trickster, and what he called the divine syzygy, the sacred pairing of masculine and feminine that represents psychological wholeness. When genuine soul recognition occurs, Jung suggested, it's because two people are encountering each other not just as individuals but as representatives of archetypal patterns that complement each other at the deepest levels of the psyche. Their souls recognize each other because they're connected to the same universal patterns of meaning, the same archetypal templates for psychological completion. But here's where modern people often get confused. They think soul recognition means they've found the one, their single destined partner who will complete them and solve all their relationship problems. They interpret the feeling of recognition as proof that this person is meant to be their eternal romantic partner. This is a dangerous misunderstanding. Soul recognition is not a guarantee of romantic compatibility. It's not a promise that the relationship will be easy or even that it will last. It's simply an indication that you've encountered someone who reflects something essential in your own psyche, someone who can serve as a catalyst for your psychological development and spiritual growth. Many soul connections are not meant to be romantic relationships at all. Some are friendships, mentorships, brief encounters that change your life in a moment and then move on. Some are challenging relationships that force you to confront aspects of yourself you've been avoiding. Some are healing relationships that help you integrate wounded parts of your psyche. The soul recognizes what it needs for growth, not necessarily what the ego wants for comfort. And this distinction is crucial for understanding the true nature of soul-level connection. Marcus and Elena's story illustrates this perfectly. Their initial recognition was profound, unmistakable, transformative. But their relationship was not a fairy tale romance. It was a complex, challenging, ultimately growth-promoting connection that forced both of them to confront aspects of themselves they had been avoiding. Elena's soul recognized in Marcus the masculine principle she needed to integrate within herself, not to project onto him, but to develop consciously through their relationship. Marcus's soul recognized in Elena the feminine wisdom he needed to access within his own psyche, not to depend on her for, but to activate through their connection. Their relationship became a mirror, a catalyst, a sacred space for mutual individuation. They didn't complete each other in the codependent sense. They inspired each other to become more complete within themselves. This is the true purpose of soul recognition, to identify the people who can serve as catalysts for your psychological and spiritual development, not to find someone who will solve your problems or fill your empty spaces, but to encounter someone who will challenge you to become more fully yourself. Jung observed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Soul recognition identifies the people who can help you claim that privilege, who can reflect back to you aspects of your authentic self that have been hidden or dormant, who can create the conditions for your full flowering as an individuated human being. But this kind of recognition requires a level of psychological development that most people haven't achieved. You can only recognize soul-level connection if you've developed some awareness of your own soul, if you've done the work of moving beyond persona identification, shadow projection, and anima-animus confusion. People who are still trapped in unconscious patterns will interpret every strong attraction as soul recognition. They'll project spiritual significance onto psychological phenomena. They'll convince themselves that every person who triggers strong emotions is their twin flame or soulmate or divine complement. This is why genuine soul recognition is actually quite rare. Most people live their entire lives in the realm of persona attraction, shadow projection, and animus confusion. They never develop the psychological sophistication necessary to distinguish between these unconscious patterns and genuine soul-level connection. But when it does occur, when two people who have done the work of becoming conscious encounter each other in the fullness of their authentic being, the recognition is unmistakable. It transcends logic because it operates from a deeper layer of consciousness than rational thinking. It feels ancient because it connects to archetypal patterns that are older than individual experience. It feels inevitable because it emerges from the soul's intelligence rather than the ego's desires. So let me ask you, have you ever experienced this kind of recognition? Not the desperate attraction of projection, not the compulsive chemistry of shadow dynamics, not the idealization of animus confusion, but the peaceful, ancient, inevitable feeling of recognition that whispers, of course it's you. If so, you've experienced the first clue of genuine soul connection. But recognition is just the beginning, because true soul love reveals itself not just in the initial encounter, but in the quality of the relationship that unfolds over time. This brings us to the second clue, perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of genuine soul connection. Are you ready to discover how real love provides both the deepest safety and the greatest challenge you'll ever experience? 6 months into their relationship, Marcus and Elena faced a crisis that would have destroyed most connections built on projection or persona attraction. Elena had been offered a prestigious fellowship in Switzerland, a year-long opportunity to study analytical psychology at the Jung Institute in Zurich. It was her dream, the culmination of years of preparation and study, but it meant leaving Marcus behind, potentially ending their relationship just as it was deepening into something profound. For most couples, this would have been a devastating choice. Love or career, relationship or individual growth, security or expansion. But Marcus and Elena's connection operated from a different paradigm entirely. Their love was not based on possession, dependency, or the fear of loss. It was based on recognition, soul recognizing soul, and genuine soul love wants the beloved to become fully themselves, even when that growth leads into unknown territory. Go, Marcus told her without hesitation, without negotiation, without the subtle manipulation that often masquerades as selfless support. This is who you are. This is what your soul is calling you toward. I love you too much to let my fear of losing you prevent you from becoming who you're meant to be. Elena felt something she had never experienced in previous relationships, unconditional support for her individual growth, even when that growth might threaten the relationship itself. Not the conditional love that says, I support your dreams as long as they don't interfere with our connection, but the fierce, liberating love that says, I love who you are, becoming more than I fear who you might become. This is the second clue of genuine soul recognition, the paradoxical experience of feeling completely safe while being constantly challenged to grow. It's the opposite of most relationship dynamics, which provide either safety without growth, comfortable but stagnant connections, or growth without safety, exciting but unstable attractions. Jung wrote about this paradox in his analysis of what he called holding the tension of opposites. He observed that psychological maturity required the ability to contain contradictory experiences without collapsing them into false simplicity. And nowhere is this capacity more essential than in conscious love relationships. Most people seek relationships that provide either comfort or excitement, stability or growth, security or adventure. They don't understand that genuine love requires both simultaneously: the safety to be vulnerable combined with the challenge to evolve, the comfort of acceptance combined with the inspiration to transcend current limitations. This paradox emerges naturally when two individuated people encounter each other in authentic relationship. Because they're not seeking completion through each other, they can provide the safety of unconditional acceptance. Because they're committed to their own growth, they naturally challenge each other to expand beyond current boundaries. Elena felt completely accepted by Marcus, not for her persona, not for her potential, not for what she could provide him, but for the essential being she was beneath all roles and identities. This acceptance created a psychological safety she had never experienced before, a sense that she could be completely herself, without fear of judgment or rejection. But simultaneously, Marcus's presence challenged her to become more than she had ever been. Not through criticism or demands, but through the mirror of his own authenticity, his own commitment to growth, his own refusal to settle for less than full psychological development. His very being seemed to ask, "What would you become if you were completely free to be yourself?" This is radically different from the conditional acceptance that characterizes most relationships. Conditional love says, "I accept you as long as you don't change in ways that threaten my security." Conditional growth says, "I challenge you to grow as long as that growth serves my needs." But soul love operates from a completely different paradigm. It says, "I accept you so completely that you're free to become whoever you're meant to be, and I love your becoming so much that I'll challenge you to claim the fullest expression of your authentic self, even if that evolution takes you beyond what I can understand or control." This creates what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold opposing tensions without resolving them prematurely. In conscious relationships, this means being able to experience both attachment and freedom, both intimacy and autonomy, both love and independence as complementary aspects of a more complex truth. Marcus faced his own version of this challenge when Elena left for Switzerland. His ego wanted to cling, to negotiate, to find ways to make her growth fit within the boundaries of his comfort. His fears whispered stories about long-distance relationships, about intellectual women who outgrow their partners, about the impossibility of maintaining connection across continents. But his soul recognized something different. Elena's growth was not a threat to their connection. It was the very purpose of their connection. They had not come together to limit each other's development, but to catalyze it. Her journey to Switzerland was not taking her away from him, but deeper into herself. And her deeper self was what he had fallen in love with in the first place. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Genuine soul connections exist to serve this privilege, to create the conditions where both people can claim their full psychological and spiritual development. But this requires a fundamental shift in how we understand the purpose of romantic relationships. Most people enter relationships seeking security, validation, companionship, or completion. They want partners who will maintain their comfort zones, reflect their self-image, and provide predictable emotional experiences. Soul connections serve a different purpose entirely. They exist to promote individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming a whole, authentic, fully developed human being. This process is inherently challenging because it requires confronting everything within yourself that remains unconscious, undeveloped, or integrated. When Elena returned from Switzerland a year later, she was profoundly changed. The intensive study, the cultural immersion, The challenge of independence in a foreign country had activated aspects of her personality that had been dormant or underdeveloped. She was more confident, more intellectually sophisticated, more emotionally complex. Some relationships would not have survived this level of individual transformation. Partners often feel threatened when their beloved returns from growth experiences fundamentally changed. The person they fell in love with seems to have been replaced by someone more complicated, less predictable, harder to control. But Marcus experienced Elena's growth as a gift. She had become more herself, not someone different. The qualities he had recognized in their first encounter had deepened, matured, found fuller expression. She was still the woman whose soul he had recognized across a crowded bookstore. But now she was more so, more Elena than she had ever been before. And their relationship had grown to accommodate her expansion. Instead of demanding that she contract back to her previous limitations, Marcus had used the year of separation to do his own growth work. He had explored aspects of himself that her absence had revealed, had developed capacities that her independence had challenged him to cultivate. When they reunited, it was not as the same people who had separated 12 months earlier. They were both more individuated, more self-aware, more capable of conscious relating. Their love had not only survived their individual growth, it had been deepened and enriched by it. This is the hallmark of genuine soul connection. It provides both the safety to be vulnerable and the challenge to evolve. It creates conditions where both people can risk the unknown territories of their own becoming while feeling held by unconditional acceptance. But this paradox requires tremendous psychological sophistication from both partners. It requires the ability to love someone's becoming more than their being, to support their growth more than their comfort, to choose their evolution over your security. Most people are not prepared for this level of conscious relating. They want love to be simple, predictable, contained within familiar boundaries. They want relationships that maintain their current level of development rather than challenging them to transcend it. But Jung discovered that the psyche has its own agenda, its own drive toward wholeness and integration. When two people connect at the soul level, they become servants of this deeper intelligence. Their relationship becomes a vehicle for mutual individuation rather than mutual security. This doesn't mean that soul connections are always dramatic or challenging. Much of the time, they provide the deep peace and satisfaction that comes from being truly known and accepted, but they also provide the gentle, persistent invitation to become more than you've ever been before. Elena described it as being loved into my own becoming. She felt Marcus's love not as a demand to be something specific, but as an invitation to discover what she was capable of becoming. His acceptance gave her permission to be herself. His growth inspired her to expand her definition of who herself might be. Marcus experienced it as loving someone's potential into manifestation. He didn't love Elena for who she was in static terms, but for who she was always becoming. His love was not possessive, but generative. It wanted to see what would emerge from the unique combination of her essence and her evolution. This is radically different from the kind of love that seeks to freeze someone in time, to keep them exactly as they are when you fall in love with them. Soul love recognizes that the beloved is a dynamic, evolving being whose full potential can never be known in advance. It's also different from the kind of love that projects expectations onto the beloved, that falls in love with someone's potential rather than their actuality. Soul love sees clearly who someone is right now, while simultaneously holding space for who they might become. So let me ask you, have you ever experienced this paradox in a relationship? The simultaneous feeling of complete safety and constant challenge? The experience of being loved so completely that you felt free to grow in directions you couldn't predict or control? If so, you've encountered the second clue of genuine soul recognition. But this paradox of comfort and growth manifests in ways that go far beyond individual development. It extends into the realm of the mysterious, the symbolic, the synchronistic. Are you ready to discover how the unconscious itself begins to speak when two souls recognize each other? Let's explore the third clue, the language of dreams, symbols, and meaningful coincidences. 3 weeks before Elena was scheduled to return from Switzerland, Marcus had a dream that changed everything. In the dream, he was walking through a forest in autumn, leaves falling around him like golden snow. Ahead on the path, he saw a woman sitting by a clear stream, reading a book. As he approached, she looked up, and he realized it was Elena, but not Elena as he had known her. This Elena was more luminous, more integrated, carrying herself with a confidence and depth that seemed both familiar and completely new. In the dream, she smiled and said, "I've been waiting for you to catch up." Then she handed him the book she'd been reading. On the cover was an image he had never seen before. 2 trees growing from the same root system, their branches intertwining to form a perfect circle. He woke with the image burned into his memory and a sense of profound anticipation he couldn't logically explain. 2 days later, browsing in a bookstore during his lunch break, Marcus froze. There, on the cover of a book about Jungian psychology, was the exact image from his dream. 2 trees growing from shared roots, branches forming a circle. The book was titled The Inner Marriage: Psychological Integration in Conscious Relationships. That evening, he received an email from Elena. She was returning earlier than planned, and she was bringing him a gift, a painting she had done during her time in Switzerland. The painting, she wrote, had come to her in a dream. 2 trees growing from the same earth, their branches creating a mandala of connection. Neither had told the other about their dream. This is the third clue of genuine soul recognition. The unconscious itself begins to communicate through symbols, dreams, and synchronicities that seem to orchestrate meaningful connections across time and space. It's as if the deeper layers of the psyche, recognizing a profound connection, mobilize to support and confirm what the conscious mind might struggle to understand or accept. Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggest a deeper order of connection between inner psychological states and outer events. He wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see it." But he also warned that synchronicity thinking could become a trap, a way of avoiding psychological responsibility by attributing everything to cosmic design. So how do you distinguish between genuine synchronicity and the human tendency to find meaning in random events? How do you recognize when the unconscious is truly supporting a soul connection versus when you're projecting spiritual significance onto ordinary coincidences? The first criterion is quality over quantity. Genuine synchronicity around soul connections tends to be profound, unmistakable, and relatively rare. It's not the constant stream of signs that characterizes wishful thinking or spiritual bypassing, but specific moments of meaningful connection that feel both surprising and inevitable. The second criterion is psychological relevance. True synchronicities and soul connections don't just confirm what you want to believe. They reveal something about the deeper psychological dynamics at play. They point toward growth, integration, or understanding that serves the individuation process of both people. Marcus and Elena's shared tree imagery wasn't just a romantic coincidence. It was a symbolic representation of what Jung called the royal coupling, the integration of masculine and feminine principles that creates psychological wholeness. The trees growing from shared roots suggested their deep connection. The circular mandala formed by their branches represented the completeness that emerges when two individuated beings come together consciously. The timing of the synchronicity was also significant. It occurred when both were on the verge of a new phase in their relationship, when Elena's growth in Switzerland was about to be integrated with their connection. The unconscious seemed to be preparing them for this transition, providing symbolic guidance for the challenges ahead. This points to another characteristic of genuine synchronicity in soul connections. It often occurs at transition points, moments when the relationship is evolving into new territory. The unconscious provides symbolic guidance precisely when the conscious mind needs support for navigating unfamiliar psychological terrain. But Jung also observed that dreams and synchronicities around relationships could be compensatory, providing balance to conscious attitudes that have become too one-sided. Sometimes the unconscious speaks to correct misunderstandings, challenge assumptions, or warn against dangers that consciousness hasn't recognized. Elena, for instance, had a series of dreams during her time in Switzerland that challenged her growing identification with independence and intellectual achievement. In these dreams, she was always alone, brilliantly accomplished but isolated, successful but somehow incomplete. The dreams didn't negate her growth, but reminded her that individuation includes relationship, that becoming whole doesn't mean becoming self-sufficient. One particularly powerful dream showed her as a lighthouse, sending out beams of light across dark waters. She was providing guidance for ships navigating treacherous currents, but she herself was fixed in place, unable to journey or explore. She woke understanding that her development in Switzerland was only half the story. She also needed to learn how to maintain her authenticity while remaining open to deep connection. These compensatory dreams prevented her from swinging too far toward independence at the expense of intimacy. They reminded her that genuine individuation includes the capacity for conscious relationship, that becoming yourself doesn't mean becoming separate from others. Marcus had his own compensatory dreams during their separation. While his conscious attitude was supportive of Elena's growth, his dreams revealed deeper fears and concerns that he hadn't acknowledged. In one recurring dream, he was trying to hold on to water with his bare hands. The harder he squeezed, the faster it slipped away. He woke understanding that his attempt to support Elena's independence was actually a subtle form of control, a way of trying to ensure that her growth wouldn't threaten their connection. The dream challenged him to examine whether his acceptance of her journey was genuinely unconditional or whether it contained hidden expectations about how her growth would unfold. It forced him to confront his own attachment and find more authentic ways of loving that didn't require any particular outcome. This is how the unconscious supports genuine soul connections, not through constant validation and romantic imagery, but through honest reflection of the psychological dynamics at play. It reveals projections, challenges assumptions, and provides guidance for more conscious relating. The symbolic language of dreams in soul connections often draws from what Jung called the archetypal layer of the unconscious. These are universal symbols that carry meaning across cultures and time periods. The divine wedding, the sacred marriage, the union of opposites, the integration of masculine and feminine principles. Elena began having dreams featuring ancient wedding ceremonies, not between her and Marcus as personalities, but between symbolic figures representing different aspects of the psyche. In one dream, a king and queen were united in a ceremony that transformed them both into something new. Not a merger that dissolved their individual identities, but an integration that enhanced them both. These dreams weren't about their external relationship, but about the internal psychological work that their connection was catalyzing. Elena was learning to integrate her own masculine and feminine aspects, using her relationship with Marcus as a mirror for understanding her own psychological wholeness. Marcus dreamed of alchemical imagery, two substances being heated together in a crucible, transforming into something more refined and precious than either had been alone. The dreams suggested that their relationship was serving an alchemical function, creating conditions for mutual transformation and purification. But perhaps the most striking aspect of the synchronicities around their connection was how they seemed to support not just their relationship, but their individual growth as well. The meaningful coincidences pointed them toward books, experiences, and insights that served their separate development as much as their connection. Elena discovered through a series of synchronistic encounters a meditation practice that helped her integrate the insights from her Switzerland experience. Marcus found himself repeatedly encountering references to a particular therapeutic approach that helped him understand his own attachment patterns. This points to a crucial characteristic of genuine soul synchronicity. It serves individuation, not just relationship. The unconscious orchestrates meaningful coincidences that support both people's psychological development, recognizing that healthy relationship depends on the continued growth of both individuals. But Jung also warned about the shadow side of synchronicity, thinking in relationships. He observed that people could become addicted to signs and symbols, using synchronicity as a way of avoiding the practical work of conscious relating. They could become so focused on cosmic confirmation that they ignored obvious red flags or practical incompatibilities. Some people interpret every strong emotion as synchronicity, every coincidence as cosmic endorsement, every symbol as spiritual validation. They convince themselves that difficult relationship dynamics are meant to be because they're accompanied by meaningful coincidences. They use synchronicity thinking to justify staying in unhealthy connections or to avoid taking responsibility for their own psychological projections. The key is to approach synchronicity with what Jung called differentiated thinking, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without collapsing into simplistic explanations. Synchronicity can be real and meaningful while also being interpreted through psychological projections. Dreams can carry profound wisdom while also reflecting unconscious wishes and fears. Marcus and Elena learned to work with synchronicity as guidance rather than gospel, as insight rather than instruction. When meaningful coincidences occurred, they used them as invitations to examine their relationship more deeply, to understand what the unconscious might be communicating about their connection and their individual development. They developed what Elena called synchronicity literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language of meaningful coincidences without becoming enslaved to it. They learned to distinguish between synchronicities that supported their growth and those that might be reflecting their projections or wishful thinking. Most importantly, they understood that synchronicity around soul connections serves the individuation process of both people. It doesn't guarantee that the relationship will last forever or that it will be easy. It simply suggests that the connection is serving a meaningful purpose in the psychological development of both individuals. So let me ask you, have you experienced meaningful coincidences, shared dreams, or symbolic connections in a relationship that felt too significant to be mere chance? Have you felt the unconscious itself supporting a connection through signs and symbols that seem to emerge from beyond your conscious control? If so, you've encountered the third clue of genuine soul recognition. But synchronicity and symbolic connection are just the beginning of how soul love reveals itself. There's another dimension of recognition that might be even more profound. The way genuine soul connections reflect not just who you are, but who you're capable of becoming. Are you ready to discover how true love serves as a mirror for your unrealized potential? I need to tell you something personal, something I've never shared publicly before. It's about the moment I understood the difference between loving someone for who they are and loving someone for who they help you become. It's about recognizing that genuine soul connection serves as a mirror not just for your shadow or your anima and animus, but for the vast territory of your unlived potential. All the aspects of yourself that remain dormant until the right person appears to call them forth. Her name was Catherine, and I met her during the darkest period of my life. I was working a corporate job that crushed my soul daily, living in a city that felt like a prison, surrounded by people who knew me only as a successful professional with his life together. Inside, I was dying. Everything creative, authentic, or spiritually meaningful in my personality had been suppressed in service of external success and social acceptability. Catherine was a painter, not professionally. She taught high school art to pay the bills, but with the kind of deep, uncompromising commitment to creative expression that I had lost years earlier. She painted late into the night after her teaching day was done, covered in colors, alive with the kind of purpose I barely remembered feeling. When I first saw her work, something in me that had been sleeping for years suddenly stirred, not because I wanted to possess her creativity or live vicariously through her artistic expression, but because her commitment to her authentic calling awakened my memory of what it felt like to have a calling of my own. This is the fourth clue of genuine soul recognition. The beloved serves as a mirror for your unrealized potential, reflecting back to you aspects of yourself that have been dormant, denied, or forgotten. Not the projection of seeking completion through someone else's qualities, but the recognition that calls forth your own dormant capacities. Jung wrote about this phenomenon in his analysis of what he called the encounter with the self, moments when we meet people who catalyze our awareness of our own unrealized possibilities. These encounters don't make us dependent on the other person for access to these qualities. Instead, they awaken our own capacity to develop them. Catherine never told me I should quit my corporate job and return to writing. She never criticized my life choices or suggested I was living inauthentically. She simply embodied such a complete commitment to her own creative calling that my unlived writer began to stir in response to her example. But this wasn't projection. I wasn't falling in love with Catherine because she represented the artist I wished I could be. I was recognizing through the mirror of her authenticity that the writer in me was still alive, still waiting for permission to emerge from the shadows of my practical, responsible, externally successful persona. This distinction is crucial for understanding genuine soul recognition. Projection seeks in others what we believe we lack in ourselves, but potential mirroring recognizes in others what already exists within us in dormant or undeveloped form. When Marcus first encountered Elena in the bookstore, reading Jung's Red Book, he wasn't projecting intellectual depth onto her because he felt intellectually inadequate. He was recognizing in her commitment to psychological exploration his own unlived potential for depth and self-understanding. Elena wasn't seeking in Marcus the strength or decisiveness she lacked. She was recognizing in his quiet confidence and emotional presence her own dormant capacity for integrated masculine expression. Not masculine qualities she needed him to provide, but masculine qualities she was ready to develop within herself. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the transcendent function, the psychological capacity that emerges when conscious and unconscious contents unite to create new possibilities. In genuine soul connections, each person's authenticity activates latent potentials in the other, creating conditions for mutual transcendence. But potential mirroring can be dangerous if it's not understood correctly. People can become addicted to relationships that make them feel more alive, more creative, more spiritual, more emotionally available than they feel on their own. They can mistake the activation of their potential for dependency on the person who activated it. This is what happened to me initially with Catherine. Being around her made me feel like the artist I had always wanted to be. Her studio became the place where I could access parts of myself that felt dead everywhere else. I began to believe that I needed her presence to feel alive, that my creativity was dependent on our connection. This created what Jung called participation mystique, a psychological state where your identity becomes merged with another person's, where you lose the ability to distinguish between your own qualities and theirs. It's a form of psychological inflation that prevents genuine individuation. The crisis came when Catherine decided to spend a summer in Europe, studying with painters whose work had inspired her for years. My immediate reaction was panic. How would I maintain connection to my creative self without her presence? How could I continue writing without the inspiration of her artistic commitment? That's when I understood the difference between projection and potential mirroring. If I had been projecting my creativity onto Catherine, her absence would have left me feeling creatively dead. But because she had actually awakened my own dormant potential, her absence became an opportunity to claim that potential as my own. I spent that summer writing, not because Catherine was there to inspire me, but because her example had reminded me that inspiration comes from within when you have the courage to commit to your authentic calling. Her influence had been catalytic, not causal. She had activated something that was already mine to claim. When she returned, our relationship had transformed. I was no longer dependent on her presence to feel like an artist. I had become an artist in my own right. She was no longer carrying my unlived creative potential. I had integrated it into my own identity. We could appreciate each other's artistic commitment without needing it, celebrate each other's growth without depending on it. This is the healthy evolution of potential mirroring in soul connections. The initial recognition that awakens dormant aspects of yourself is followed by a period of integration where you claim those aspects as your own. The relationship serves as a catalyst for your development, not as a substitute for it. Marcus and Elena went through a similar process. Initially, Elena's psychological sophistication awakened Marcus's own interest in depth psychology and self-understanding. But instead of remaining dependent on her insights, he began his own analytical work, his own study of Jung, his own journey into the unconscious. Elena found that Marcus's emotional presence and integrated masculinity activated her own capacity for strength and decisive action. But rather than looking to him to be her strength, she began developing these qualities within herself, using their relationship as a mirror for understanding her own potential for powerful self-expression. This is what Jung called individuation within relationship, the process of becoming more fully yourself through conscious connection with another individuated being. It's the opposite of codependence, where two people become less than themselves through merger, and it's also different from independence, where growth occurs in isolation from others. Soul connections create what Jung called a vessel for transformation, a psychological container strong enough to hold the process of mutual becoming. Each person's authenticity challenges the other to claim their own authentic expression. Each person's growth inspires the other to explore their own unrealized possibilities. But this process requires tremendous courage from both people. It means allowing yourself to be changed by the relationship while taking responsibility for your own transformation. It means using the other person as a mirror without making them responsible for what you see reflected there. Catherine and I had to learn this balance. In the beginning, I expected her to maintain her role as my creative inspiration. When she had difficult periods, when her own artistic work was challenging, or when she felt disconnected from her creativity, I felt threatened. If she wasn't embodying creative aliveness, how could I access it through her? This revealed that I was still partially dependent on her energy rather than fully claiming my own. The real work was learning to maintain connection to my creativity, whether she was having a good day or a difficult one, whether she was feeling inspired or struggling with her own blocks. Similarly, Catherine had to learn that my growth as a writer wasn't a threat to her identity as an artist. Initially, she felt some competition when my writing began to develop its own momentum. She had been used to being the artistic one in the relationship, and my creative development challenged her to examine her own relationship to recognition and uniqueness.